The Silent Washer. The Grand Silver Crest Hotel stood as a monument to opulence, its towering glass facade reflecting the city skyline like a mirror of privilege. Guests arrived in sleek black cars, their drivers swiftly unloading designer luggage onto golden luggage carts. The scent of fresh lilies filled the air as chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the marble floors. Behind the scenes, however, the true heartbeat of the hotel belonged to its workers. Housekeepers, janitors, bellhops, each one ensuring that the wealthy clientele never saw a single smudge, a single wrinkle, a single inconvenience. Among them was James "Jimmy" Carter, an elderly black janitor whose quiet presence had become part of the hotel's foundation. For over 3 decades, Jimmy had cleaned the hallways, buffed the floors, and ensured the Silver Crest gleamed with perfection. His weathered hands had scrubbed every inch of this place, yet few ever acknowledged him beyond a dismissive nod or an impersonal good job. But Jimmy didn't mind. Not much, anyway. He took pride in his work, the way his mop slid smoothly over the floors, the way the brass shined when he wiped it down. It was honest labor. And honest labor was enough. Or so he had thought. The day shift had just begun, and Jimmy pushed his janitor's cart down the lavish corridor leading to the presidential suite's restroom. The presidential suite, a place he had been inside only when called upon to clean up some rich man's mess. As he rolled his cart forward, voices drifted through the slightly ajar doors. Laughter, but not the pleasant kind, the kind that mocked. Jimmy hesitated, recognizing the grating voice of Gregory Townsend, the hotel's owner, a man whose wealth seemed to buy him arrogance in bulk. Jimmy had long learned to avoid Gregory's attention. The man saw staff as disposable, like coasters to be used and discarded without thought. But today, something kept Jimmy standing there. Something told him not to move. Inside the restroom, Gregory's voice grew louder. "You ever look at yourself, Jimmy? I mean, really look." Jimmy stiffened. A second voice, one younger, smug, chuckled in response. "Come on, Greg, you're gonna make the poor guy cry." Gregory ignored him. "Do you even know why you're still a janitor, Jimmy? At your age, you ever think about that?" Jimmy kept his head bowed, gripping the handle of his cart. He had been through worse. Words were just words. "You see, my father, rest his soul, used to say that people like you don't aim high because you already know your place," Gregory continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some men are meant to own, and others are meant to serve." Jimmy's fingers curled into fists, but he said nothing. His silence only fueled Gregory's amusement. "Tell me, Jimmy, when you were a kid, what did you dream of becoming? A doctor? A businessman? Or did you always know you'd be scrubbing floors?" The younger man laughed again. Jimmy clenched his jaw, but before he could respond, Gregory delivered the final blow. "You know what the real joke is? That I let someone like you even work here. This is a 5-star establishment. And people like you." Gregory gave a dismissive wave. "Don't belong in a place like this." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the hiss of the automatic sink. Jimmy stood rooted to the spot, staring at the pristine tiles beneath his feet. He had heard insults before, but never like this, never so direct. Never from someone with so much power. The moment stretched unbearably. Then, Gregory sighed theatrically. "Well, don't just stand there, Jimmy. Mop the floor like a good little worker, would you?" Jimmy's grip tightened on the mop handle, his body stiff as stone. He had spent 30 years being invisible in this hotel, swallowing disrespect, forcing himself to believe that dignity came not from how others saw him, but from the quality of his work. But right now, his very existence felt like a punchline in someone else's joke. He took a slow, measured breath and stepped forward. He would not give Gregory the satisfaction of seeing him break. But just as he moved toward the sink, a deep, smooth voice cut through the air like a knife. "I think that's enough." Gregory and his friend froze. So did Jimmy. Because that voice was familiar. The stall door creaked open, and out stepped a man. Tall, lean, with dark eyes that carried a weight of experience. A man whose face the world recognized in an instant. Johnny Depp. The silence that followed was electric. Gregory's smirk vanished. His once confident stance wavered as he stared, dumbstruck, at the world-famous actor standing before him. Johnny Depp leaned casually against the stall door, adjusting the rings on his fingers as he took in the scene. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. "But I couldn't help overhearing. Well, all of that." Jimmy blinked, still trying to process what was happening. Gregory, scrambling to recover, forced a laugh. "Mr. Depp, what a pleasure. I didn't know you were." Johnny held up a hand. "Yeah, let's skip the fake pleasantries." His voice remained low, almost conversational. But there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Gregory shut his mouth. Johnny turned his attention to Jimmy, his eyes softening slightly. "Sir," Johnny said, inclining his head, "I don't believe we've met properly. What's your name?" Jimmy hesitated. No celebrity had ever acknowledged him, much less asked for his name. Jimmy Carter," he said quietly. Johnny smiled faintly. "Good to meet you, Jimmy." Gregory cut in, visibly sweating now. "Look, this is all just a misunderstanding." Johnny's gaze snapped back to him. "Oh, I understood perfectly." The way he said it made the air heavy, like a storm was about to break. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. "You know how it is, just a little banter with the staff." Johnny's lips twitched. "Banter." He folded his arms. "Gregory, I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between banter and humiliation." Gregory flushed. "And from what I just heard," Johnny's voice dropped slightly, his next words ice cold, "you're the kind of man who doesn't deserve the people working for you." Jimmy's heart thudded in his chest. Gregory's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Johnny Depp smiled, but there was no warmth in it. And for the first time in 30 years, Jimmy saw something he had never witnessed before. The owner of the Silver Crest Hotel looked afraid. A storm brewing. The silence in the luxury restroom of the Silver Crest Hotel stretched like a taut wire. The weight of Johnny Depp's words hung in the air, a slow, simmering fire beneath Gregory Townsend's carefully curated mask of confidence. Jimmy Carter stood frozen, still gripping the mop handle as if it were a lifeline. For the first time in his 30 years working at the hotel, someone important, had actually stood up for him. Gregory forced a smile, but there was a crack in his usual arrogance. "Now, Mr. Depp," Gregory started, smoothing his silk tie, "I think you might have misinterpreted the situation. You see, Jimmy and I go way back. Don't we, Jimmy?" Jimmy's jaw tightened. The way Gregory said his name, like it was some kind of insult, set his blood boiling. But still, he said nothing. What could he say? The man owned the hotel. His job, his livelihood. Johnny Depp, however, wasn't buying it. He tilted his head slightly, dark eyes sharp and unblinking. "You've known Jimmy a long time, va?" Gregory nodded too quickly. "Oh, of course. Loyal staff is hard to come by. Jimmy's been with us forever." "Aha." Johnny's voice was dry, unimpressed. He turned to Jimmy. "And tell me, Jimmy, is that how it feels? Like you're appreciated here?" Jimmy hesitated. His entire body screamed at him to be careful. He wasn't a fool. He knew that speaking up could mean losing his job. But something had changed. Maybe it was the fact that Johnny Depp was still here, waiting for his answer. Maybe it was the fact that for once, Gregory looked genuinely nervous. Or maybe it was just that Jimmy was too damn tired of being treated like dirt. Slowly, he straightened his back. "With all due respect, sir," he said, keeping his voice steady, "if I was really valued here, I don't think we'd be having this conversation." Gregory's smile faltered. Johnny's, however, grew wider. "That's what I thought." Gregory let out a stiff laugh. Look, let's not make a big deal out of this. I mean, really, what does it matter? He's just a janitor. Johnny's expression darkened. The room felt colder. For a moment, he simply stared at Gregory, and when he finally spoke, his words were measured. Dangerous. Say that again. Gregory blinked. What? Johnny took a slow step forward, and despite being a full head shorter, Gregory visibly flinched. I said, Johnny repeated, his voice smooth but deadly quiet. Say that again. A thick silence swallowed the room. Gregory opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to say. Johnny exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. See, Gregory, guys like you. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You love to talk big when no one important is around, but the second someone is watching, you fold. Like a cheap deck of cards. Gregory's jaw clenched, humiliation creeping into his expression. Now, Mr. Depp, Gregory said stiffly, his voice tight with forced politeness. I understand that emotions are running high, but you must understand. Understand what? Johnny interrupted. His tone was still cool, but there was something sharp, controlled, deliberate behind it. Gregory inhaled deeply, clearly losing patience. That you are a guest, and he is an employee. And as the owner of this hotel, I decide how things run here. Johnny tilted his head slightly, a slow grin creeping up his face. That's funny. Gregory frowned. What is? Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. Because from what I can tell, Johnny said, tapping the screen, you won't be the owner of this hotel for much longer. Jimmy's eyes widened. Gregory's face drained of color. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Johnny shrugged, scrolling through something on his phone. Oh, just a little conversation I recorded. The one where you humiliated a longtime employee, threw in some good old-fashioned racism and age discrimination. Gregory took a step forward, eyes blazing. You can't. Johnny cut him off again. Oh, but I did. He turned the phone around, showing a screen filled with recording bars. Gregory stopped breathing. Here's the thing, Johnny continued, mockingly tapping his chin. This hotel has quite a few very rich and very famous guests, doesn't it? He raised a brow. And I'd bet my last dollar that none of them would like to be associated with a place run by someone who treats his staff like garbage. Gregory visibly swallowed. The smirk on Johnny's face never wavered. I also have a couple of, let's say, influential friends who'd love to make sure this video gets the attention it deserves. Gregory finally found his voice. You wouldn't. Johnny simply smiled. Try me. The room was dead silent. Jimmy could barely process what he was witnessing. Gregory Townsend, the man who had owned this hotel for years, who had treated his staff like nothing but expendable labor, was shaking. And for the first time, Jimmy saw the cracks in the foundation. The powerful weren't always as untouchable as they seemed. Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked like a man trying desperately to figure a way out of this. Mr. Depp, he started, his voice much less arrogant now. Surely we can come to some arrangement. Johnny sighed dramatically, shoving his phone back into his pocket. See, Gregory, that's what I love about people like you. He smiled again, cold as ice. You don't regret what you did. You just regret getting caught. Gregory opened his mouth. But then a new voice rang through the room. Well, this is awkward. Jimmy turned, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing in the doorway, watching everything unfold, was the Silver Crest's board of directors. And they did not look happy. The fall of a king. A hush fell over the gleaming marble restroom of the Silver Crest Hotel, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Gregory Townsend, the arrogant owner who had spent years treating his staff like disposable tools, now stood frozen, his face draining of color. Because standing at the entrance of the bathroom, arms crossed, was Jonathan Ellsworth, the chairman of the Silver Crest Board of Directors, Gregory's boss. And he wasn't alone. Behind him stood three of the hotel's most powerful stakeholders, their faces unreadable but their presence unmistakable. Jimmy Carter, still gripping his mop, felt his heart race. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. Johnny Depp, standing beside him, exhaled through his nose and tilted his head slightly, watching the scene unfold with the detached amusement of a man who already knew how this would end. "Well, this is awkward," Jonathan Ellsworth repeated, stepping further into the room, his polished dress shoes clicking ominously against the tile. Gregory swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Jonathan, what a pleasant surprise," he stammered. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Jonathan ignored him. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the discarded mop water still streaked across the floor, Jimmy's soaked uniform, and Johnny Depp watching with barely concealed amusement. His gaze landed on Jimmy, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan said, his voice steady, polite. "Are you all right?" Jimmy hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. Not once in 30 years. He cleared his throat, straightening his spine, despite his damp uniform clinging uncomfortably to his back. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm all right now." Jonathan nodded, but his sharp green eyes flickered back to Johnny. "Mr. Depp," he said smoothly, "you seem involved in all this." Johnny smiled, slow and deliberate. "Oh, just a concerned guest," he said. "I happened to witness something today. Something I thought you might be interested in." Jonathan arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Johnny pulled out his phone again, casually flipping it around, the recording screen still glowing. Gregory visibly stiffened. "Oh yes," Johnny mused. "I just happened to hear a rather enlightening conversation about how certain hotel owners treat their staff." He paused, then smiled wider. "Would you like to hear it?" Gregory reacted instantly. "That won't be necessary," he snapped, stepping forward. "There's been a misunderstanding here, Jonathan." Jonathan finally turned to him, his expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" Gregory nodded frantically. This is all being blown out of proportion. You know how staff banter goes, right? Jimmy and I aren't friends." Jimmy cut in before he could stop himself. Gregory's mouth snapped shut. For the first time, Jimmy didn't care. He had spent years swallowing his pride, years biting his tongue, years telling himself to just keep his head down and keep working. But not anymore. Not after today. Jonathan's gaze lingered on Jimmy for a beat too long, as if assessing him, weighing something in his mind. Then, he exhaled slowly. "Well, Gregory," he said, clasping his hands behind his back, "it seems we have quite the problem on our hands." Gregory flinched. "Jonathan, Enough." The word was sharp, final. And for the first time, Gregory shut up. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan took a step forward, his presence looming, heavy with authority. "I've known you a long time, Gregory," he said, his voice even cold. "And I've overlooked a lot of things in that time. Your arrogance, your questionable business decisions, your blatant disregard for company policy." He turned, his piercing gaze locking onto Gregory's. "But what I will not overlook is the public humiliation and abuse of an employee." Gregory went rigid. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice wavering. Jonathan's lips curled into something dangerously close to a smirk. "Oh, I'm very serious." Gregory's confidence shattered. He looked between the board members, searching for support, but none of them came to his defense. And in that moment, he knew. The Silver Crest Hotel was no longer his. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, you can't do this." "We can," Jonathan interrupted. "And we are." He turned slightly, glancing at one of the board members. "Prepare the paperwork," he said smoothly. Gregory Townsend is to be immediately removed from his position as owner and CEO of the Silver Crest Hotel. Gregory staggered backward, as if he'd been physically struck. "No," he whispered. "This is my hotel." "Not anymore," Jonathan said. "As of this moment, the Silver Crest Hotel is under new management." Gregory sputtered, shaking his head in disbelief. "You can't do this," he said again, but it sounded weak, desperate. Jonathan tilted his head. "Actually, I can," he said simply. And then, with finality, "Security." Two suited guards stepped into the room, their expressions neutral. Gregory whirled toward them. "You touch me, and I'll." One of the guards grabbed his arm. Gregory yelped, struggling. "Let go of me." Jonathan watched with cold amusement. "Escort Mr. Townsend off the premises," he said smoothly. "He is no longer welcome here." Gregory was still fighting, still screaming when he was dragged through the doors. And then, silence, a silence that felt like the end of something. Jimmy couldn't breathe. Had he really just watched Gregory Townsend get taken down in real time? Had Johnny Depp just single-handedly ended a man's career? Jimmy turned slowly, his eyes wide, but Johnny simply shrugged. Well, that was satisfying. Jonathan smirked. That it was. He turned back to Jimmy. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I imagine this is the last thing you expected when you walked in here today." Jimmy exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You could say that, sir." Jonathan nodded. "I won't pretend that what you've been through today was fair, and I won't insult you by saying this fixes everything. But what I can say is this: your loyalty, your work, and your dignity matter." He extended a hand. Jimmy stared at it for a long moment, before slowly reaching out and shaking it. A long, firm handshake. "You are not invisible," Jonathan said quietly. "Not anymore." Jimmy felt something shift inside him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Johnny clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Hell of a day, huh?" Jimmy let out a low chuckle. "You have no idea. A new beginning, a reckoning to come." The Silver Crest Hotel had always thrived on perfection, pristine chandeliers, polished marble, and whispers of wealth floating through its gilded halls. But tonight, perfection had shattered. Gregory Townsend was gone. The once untouchable owner, humiliated and dragged out by security, had left a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Employees exchanged glances, whispers spreading like wildfire. The dictator had fallen, and for the first time in decades, something new filled the air. Change. And at the heart of it stood Jimmy Carter. An invitation like no other. Jimmy stood near the grand ballroom entrance, his mop and bucket long forgotten, his mind still racing. He had spent 30 years keeping his head down, scrubbing floors, and swallowing insults. But now people were looking at him differently. Staff members he'd worked with for years, ones who had barely acknowledged him beyond a nod, now approached with hushed awe. Some patted his back. Others simply nodded, eyes filled with an unspoken gratitude. But the real surprise came when Jonathan Ellsworth, the chairman of the board, turned toward him with a look that Jimmy couldn't quite place. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "I'd like you to join us in the ballroom." Jimmy's eyebrows shot up. "Me?" Jonathan gave a small smile. "Yes, you." Jimmy glanced at his janitor's uniform, still damp from Gregory's abuse, then back at the grand ballroom, where the city's elite were gathered, laughing over champagne. A janitor had no place there. "I don't think that's a good idea, sir," Jimmy said carefully. Jonathan's smile didn't waver. "And why's that?" Jimmy let out a short laugh. "Sir, I've been cleaning those restrooms for decades, and I ain't never seen a man like me in that room, unless he was serving the drinks or scrubbing the floors." Jonathan's expression shifted slightly, something thoughtful flickering behind his sharp green eyes. "Well," he said, clapping a hand on Jimmy's shoulder, "maybe it's time that changed." And with that, he led the way. Johnny Depp, still watching from the sidelines with an amused smirk, winked at Jimmy before following suit. The ballroom that never welcomed him. The grand ballroom doors swung open, revealing a sea of wealth. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in a golden glow, illuminating designer gowns, sharp tuxedos, and the kind of carefree laughter that only the rich could afford. It was a world Jimmy had always been just outside of, a world he had kept spotless, but never belonged in. Until now. The second he stepped in, conversation slowed. Heads turned. Eyes flickered from his plain janitor's uniform to the powerful men standing beside him. It didn't take long for the murmurs to start. Who is he? Why is a janitor in here? It's he with Johnny Depp. Jimmy kept his face calm, but inside, his stomach twisted. He didn't want to be some charity case. He didn't want people looking at him like he was a stray dog someone had dragged in. He wanted respect. And that would take time. He kept walking, his back straight, following Jonathan Ellsworth and Johnny Depp through the room. And then, at the center of it all, Jonathan raised a hand, silencing the whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with the authority of a man used to being heard. "As many of you know, we were gathered here tonight to celebrate the workers who keep this establishment running. But before we move forward, there's something you all should know. A hush spread. In this very hotel, a longtime employee, someone who has served this place with loyalty and dedication for over 30 years, was publicly humiliated and abused by our former owner." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jonathan continued, unfazed. He was degraded, insulted, and treated as if he were nothing. Jonathan's sharp eyes swept across the audience. And yet, he stood his ground. With dignity, with resilience. He has done more for this hotel than most of us in this room. And tonight, I'd like to honor him. He turned toward Jimmy, his expression genuine. "Mr. Carter, would you come up here?" Jimmy froze. His heart pounded as every set of eyes in the room settled on him. For a brief moment, fear whispered in his ear. What if they don't respect you? What if they think this is all a joke? What if you make a fool of yourself? But then, he caught Johnny Depp's gaze. The actor was watching him closely, nodding slightly as if to say, "You've got this." And just like that, Jimmy took a step forward. The speech that changed everything. Jimmy stepped onto the stage, the microphone looming before him. He had never spoken to a crowd like this. Not once in his life. But when he looked out at the faces before him, he realized something. These people weren't better than him. They weren't smarter than him. They were just luckier. So Jimmy took a slow breath, then leaned into the mic. "My name is James Carter," he said, his deep voice steady despite the nervousness in his gut. "But most of you never knew that. I've been cleaning this hotel for over 3 decades. Some of you have seen me mopping floors. Some of you have passed me in the halls. And some of you never noticed me at all." The crowd fell completely silent. "But I noticed you," Jimmy continued. "I noticed how some of you treated us, how some of you looked through us, like we weren't even there, like we weren't worth remembering." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. "I never wanted much," Jimmy said. "Just respect. Just to be treated like a human being." He let the words sink in before he delivered the final blow. And yet the man who ran this place, the man who called himself its leader, saw me as nothing but a mop in his hallway. Murmurs swept through the ballroom. Jimmy turned, looking Jonathan in the eye. "Sir, I appreciate what you're doing here, but respect doesn't come from words. It comes from actions." A pause. And then, applause. Not the polite kind. Not the forced kind. The real kind. It started with Johnny, his hands clapping slow and steady. Then Clara, the only staff member who had ever treated Jimmy like family, stood, clapping hard, tears in her eyes. One by one, others followed, until finally, the whole damn room was on its feet, a future rewritten. As the applause roared in his ears, Jimmy knew something had changed. Not just for him. For every worker who had ever been stepped on. For every janitor, housekeeper, and busboy who had ever been made to feel invisible. As he stepped down from the stage, Jonathan shook his hand firmly. "You're right, Mr. Carter," he said. "Respect comes from actions." And with that, he handed Jimmy something he never expected. A contract. Jimmy blinked. "What's this?" Jonathan smiled. "Your promotion. You're no longer a janitor, Jimmy. You're the new head of staff relations." Jimmy felt his throat tighten. He had dreamed of dignity. Tonight, he had earned it. And for the first time in 30 years, Jimmy walked out of the ballroom with his head held high. A seat at the table. For the first time in his life, Jimmy Carter walked through the Silver Crest Hotel with his head high, not because he was cleaning up after someone else, but because people were finally seeing him. For 30 years, Jimmy had been a shadow in the hallways, a nameless presence who scrubbed away the messes left by people who never knew his name. But today, people moved out of his way. Today, guests nodded at him in acknowledgement. Today, the staff he had worked beside for years actually looked him in the eye. Because today, he wasn't just a janitor. He was a man who had forced this hotel to reckon with its own cruelty. And it had changed everything. The offer that changed everything. Jimmy sat in a private office, a space he had never been allowed to enter before. Jonathan Ellsworth, the chairman of the board, stood behind a massive mahogany desk, flipping through a freshly printed contract. Johnny Depp leaned against the window, his rings glinting in the afternoon light, watching with quiet amusement as Jonathan prepared to make an offer that could rewrite Jimmy's entire future. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan finally said, sliding the contract across the desk, "I meant what I said back in the ballroom. The Silver Crest Hotel is under new management, and it's time we start treating our employees with the dignity they deserve." Jimmy hesitated before reaching for the contract. His hands that had scrubbed thousands of floors, now held something he never thought possible. A job offer. Not as a janitor, not even as a housekeeper, but as the new head of staff relations. "Now," Jonathan continued, his tone businesslike but not unkind, "this position would put you in charge of staff concerns, training, and overall worker satisfaction. You'd be the bridge between the employees and upper management." Jimmy read the words carefully. A salary 3 times what he had been making. Health benefits. Retirement support. For the first time in his life, Jimmy wouldn't just be surviving. He'd be living. He exhaled sharply. This is a lot." Jonathan folded his hands together. "We need someone who understands what it's like to be on the other side of power, Jimmy. Someone who won't let the mistakes of the past be repeated." Jimmy hesitated. This job, it was everything he had never dared to dream of. But deep down, one question gnawed at him. Would this really change anything? Would this truly be the start of something better? As if sensing his hesitation, Johnny Depp finally spoke up. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "when I first walked into this hotel, I saw the luxury, the glamour, the facade." His dark eyes met Jimmy's. "But when I stepped into that restroom and heard what was happening to you," Johnny exhaled, shaking his head, "I realized how much of that grandeur was built on the backs of people like you." Jimmy swallowed hard. "Thing is," Johnny continued, "I've met men like Gregory Townsend before. Men who think they own the world because they have money. And trust me, they only change when they're forced to." He gestured to the contract. "This," Johnny said, "this is power, Jimmy. Real power. You take that job, and suddenly you're not just another worker they can ignore. You're the voice in the room they have to listen to." Jimmy looked at the contract again. His name, in bold print, on something that mattered, a seat at the table. A chance to make things better. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen. His hand shook slightly as he signed his name at the bottom of the page. And just like that, Jimmy Carter became a man with a future. First day, first fight. The next morning, Jimmy walked into the staff lounge, where dozens of employees had gathered. Clara, his longtime coworker, was the first to notice him. "Jimmy," she gasped, rushing forward. "We heard about what happened. Are you okay?" Jimmy grinned, lifting his new name badge. James Carter, head of STAFF Relations. Clara's eyes went wide. No way. The murmurs spread like wildfire. Jimmy Carter, the janitor, was now a part of management. Some employees looked hopeful, others looked wary. And some looked downright hostile. Jimmy noticed Cass, one of the senior housekeepers, standing at the back with her arms crossed. Well, she drawled. "Look who's moving up in the world." Jimmy met her challenging stare. "I am," he said evenly. "And I plan to make sure things change around here." Cass snorted. "You really think management's gonna listen to you? You think they're just gonna let some former janitor start calling the shots?" Jimmy folded his arms. "I don't think it. I know it." Cass scoffed. "Yeah. And what are you gonna do about the fact that our wages haven't gone up in 5 years?" Jimmy's jaw tightened. Because she was right. This hotel had climbed from 3 stars to 5. Yet the workers who made that happen had never seen a single bonus. But this was why he took the job. To fight for them. To fight for himself. Jimmy stepped forward. "The first thing I'm going to do," he said, his voice strong, steady, "is make sure we all get what we deserve." A hush fell over the room. Cass studied him, then smirked slightly. "Well, Jimmy," she said, "I guess we'll see what you're really made of." And with that, the war began. A promise in the dark. That night, Jimmy sat in his new office, a small but official space on the 2nd floor. He stared at the framed contract on the wall, letting it sink in. He had spent 30 years cleaning this place. Now he was one of the people who could fix it. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Johnny Depp leaned against the doorframe, grinning. "So," Johnny said, "how's it feel?" Jimmy exhaled. "Like the start of a fight I should have had a long time ago." Johnny chuckled. "Better late than never." Jimmy nodded, staring out the window, watching the city lights blink in the distance. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for sure. He would not be silent. Not anymore. The final reckoning. A battle worth fighting. The first few days of Jimmy Carter's new role as head of staff relations were nothing short of a storm brewing over the Silver Crest Hotel. While some staff members greeted him with applause and cautious optimism, others, especially those who had learned to fear change, remained skeptical. And then there were those like Cass, the senior housekeeper who had spent years watching people promise change, but never deliver. Jimmy understood their doubt, but he wasn't here to make empty promises. He was here to change everything. And he wouldn't stop until the workers of the Silver Crest Hotel were treated like human beings, not disposable labor. The first test. It didn't take long for his first battle to arrive. A week into his new role, Jimmy received an email from upper management. It was brief, almost dismissive. To James Carter. From Executive Management Team. Subject: Employee Compensation Requests. Mr. Carter, we appreciate your enthusiasm in your new role. However, we regret to inform you that an increase in wages for housekeeping and janitorial staff is not financially feasible at this time. We encourage you to focus on other ways to support employee morale. Regards, the executive team. Jimmy stared at the email, his hands tightening into fists. Not financially feasible. This hotel makes millions in profit every year. He had seen Gregory Townsend spend tens of thousands on pointless luxury upgrades, while staff wages had remained unchanged for 5 years. And they expected him to accept this. Jimmy closed his laptop and stood up. If they thought he would be another cog in their machine, they had grossly underestimated him. A fight in the boardroom. The next morning, Jimmy stormed into the boardroom. Executives sat around the long, polished table, sipping their imported coffee, discussing profit margins and brand image. Jimmy didn't wait for permission to speak. He slapped a thick folder onto the table, making several of them jump. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Jonathan Ellsworth, the new hotel chairman, arched an eyebrow. "Something on your mind, Mr. Carter?" Jimmy didn't sit. Instead, he opened the folder and laid out printed financial reports. "These documents show exactly how much this hotel has made in the past 3 years," he said. "Every time we moved up a star, the prices went up, the luxury improved, but the wages, they stayed the same." A murmur swept through the room. Jimmy kept going. "This is a 5-star hotel, a place that prides itself on luxury, on excellence." His gaze swept across the table. "But how do you expect excellence from staff who can't even afford to live in the city they work in?" Silence. Then one executive, Mr. Langley, a man who had built his career on exploiting workers, leaned back, scoffing. "Mr. Carter," he said in a slow, patronizing tone, "perhaps you don't understand how business works. We have operating costs, investor expectations." Jimmy cut him off. "Oh, I understand just fine," he said. "I understand that this hotel spends thousands of dollars every month on imported orchids for the lobby, while the housekeepers are struggling to afford rent." That shut Langley up. Jonathan leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Jimmy met his gaze without hesitation. "A 20% wage increase for all housekeeping and janitorial staff. Paid overtime, retirement benefits, and health insurance that actually covered their medical needs." The room erupted into chaos. "Impossible. This is outrageous. Do you have any idea how much that would cost?" Jimmy let them shout themselves hoarse. And then, when the noise died down, he delivered the final blow. "If you don't make this happen," he said calmly, "I'll walk right out of this boardroom, call every news outlet in the city, and tell them exactly how Silver Crest treats the people who keep this place running." Jonathan blinked. The other executives looked horrified. Jimmy continued, his voice unwavering. "I'll make sure this hotel is on the front page of every newspaper, not as a 5-star luxury destination, but as the place that treats its workers like dirt." More silence. Then Jonathan smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a cruel one, a genuine, impressed smile. "Well," Jonathan said, glancing around at his stunned colleagues, "looks like we have some decisions to make." And just like that, Jimmy had forced the most powerful men in the hotel to listen. Victory. By the end of the month, the Silver Crest hotel staff saw their first raise in 5 years. A 20% wage increase. Paid overtime. Better benefits. Jimmy had done what no one else had before. And the employees knew it. He walked through the halls that day not as a janitor, not as an invisible man, but as the man who had fought for them. For Clara. For the new housekeepers who had just started. For the janitors who had spent their lives cleaning up after people who never looked them in the eye. Cass, who had once doubted him, approached him in the break room, arms crossed. "Well," she said, smirking, "you actually pulled it off." Jimmy chuckled. "Told you I would." Cass studied him, then nodded. "All right," she said. "Maybe you really are one of us." Jimmy nodded. "I always was. A drink with an old friend." That evening, Jimmy walked out of the Silver Crest Hotel for the first time as a man who had made a difference. Waiting outside was Johnny Depp, leaning casually against a car, a bottle of expensive whiskey in one hand. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "You celebrating?" he asked. Johnny smirked. "You tell me." Jimmy hesitated. Then he nodded. They sat on a bench overlooking the city, passing the bottle between them, watching the skyline flicker like 1,000 tiny stars. After a long moment, Johnny spoke. "You know," he said, "I've spent my life playing heroes. Pirates. Outlaws. Rebels." He glanced at Jimmy. "But I think you're the real deal." Jimmy let out a breath, shaking his head. "I ain't no hero." Johnny grinned. "You keep telling yourself that." They sat there in silence, drinking under the city lights. And for the first time, in a long, long time, Jimmy Carter felt free. Epilogue. The legacy of Jimmy Carter. A year later, the Silver Crest Hotel had transformed. Under new leadership, the workers thrived. Jimmy's name became legendary among the staff. And while new employees came and went, there was always one story that remained. The story of the janitor who refused to be invisible. The man who stood up, spoke out, and changed everything. And even years later, when Jimmy finally retired, his story remained etched into the halls of the Silver Crest Hotel. Because some men don't just work in a place. They change it forever.